On July 19, 1897, a young police constable named George Snipe walked into a disturbance outside a Birmingham public house and found himself surrounded by a crowd that did not fear his uniform. There was shouting in the street. Men had been drinking. An arrest had been made, and the crowd pressed closer as the officers tried to lead their prisoner away. Then a brick was thrown. It struck Constable Snipe on the side of the head with enough force to fracture his skull. He died only hours later. He was 29 years old. The newspapers called the men who haunted streets like these by several names: sloggers, roughs, hooligans, Peaky Blinders. But the gang that history remembers was not led by Tommy Shelby. There was no Shelby family ruling Birmingham from a smoke-filled office. No war hero in a razor-edged cap quietly controlling factories, politicians, and racecourses. No criminal empire rising from a single betting shop in Small Heath. The truth was less elegant, more chaotic, and in many ways more revealing. The real Peaky Blinders were not one perfectly organized family. They were part of a violent street culture that grew from the pressure of an industrial city expanding faster than it could safely contain its people. They appeared in courts, police reports, newspapers, and prison records not as glamorous masterminds, but as young men shaped by crowded housing, dangerous work, street loyalty, alcohol, fashion, and the constant possibility of violence. And by the time the criminal underworld of Birmingham became truly organized, the original Peaky Blinders were already fading. Their place was taken by something larger. A network built around bookmakers, racecourses, protection money, railway timetables, hired fighters, and national alliances. At its center stood a real man named Billy Kimber, a Birmingham-born gang leader who would become one of the most powerful figures in British organized crime. To understand how that transformation happened, we must first return to Birmingham before the legend. Before the tailored coats and television mythology. Before the name Peaky Blinders carried the weight it carries today. We must return to a city of furnaces, workshops, canals, soot, ambition, and overcrowded courts, where thousands of people came searching for wages and found themselves living only a few steps from hunger. In the early 19th century, Birmingham was already known for metalworking and skilled manufacture. Unlike towns dominated by one enormous industry, Birmingham produced almost everything: buttons, buckles, guns, jewelry, tools, pens, chains, screws, toys, scientific instruments, household objects, decorative metalwork, small components that would travel across Britain and far beyond it. This extraordinary variety helped earn Birmingham a famous description: the city of 1,000 trades. Its strength came not only from large factories, but from thousands of workshops. Some were impressive industrial buildings. Others were little more than rooms behind houses, sheds and courtyards, or cramped spaces where a family might work beside the place where they ate and slept. The city seemed to make objects the way a furnace made sparks. Constantly, rapidly, in every direction. Canals carried coal, iron, and heavy goods through the town. Barges moved slowly beneath bridges darkened by smoke. Horses pulled loads along towpaths. Warehouses rose beside the water. Workshops crowded close to transport routes. Later, railways added speed, bringing workers, materials, visitors, and opportunity into the expanding city. The population grew with astonishing force. At the beginning of the 19th century, Birmingham had roughly 75,000 inhabitants. By the middle of the century, the population had risen to around 230,000. By 1901, it had passed 500,000. Numbers alone cannot describe what that growth felt like. Imagine streets that seemed to extend every year. Fields disappearing beneath brick. New houses constructed quickly because workers needed somewhere to sleep. Courtyards filled with families who had arrived from nearby villages, from other English counties, from Wales, and especially from Ireland, where famine and poverty had driven many people across the sea. For factory owners and merchants, population meant labor. For landlords, it meant rent. For the city, it meant wealth, noise, pressure, and a problem that became harder to ignore with each passing decade. Housing could not keep pace with human need. One answer was the back-to-back house. These were small dwellings built in rows and courts, sharing walls behind as well as beside them. A front house faced the street. Another house might face inward toward a narrow courtyard. Behind them, There was often no open garden, no rear window, and little chance for air to circulate. Inside, entire families lived in a handful of rooms. A ground floor might serve as kitchen, living space, workshop, and sleeping area depending on the hour. Bedrooms were crowded. Lodgers might be taken in to help pay rent. Children shared beds. Parents slept close to infants. Privacy was a luxury rarely available to the poor. In the courtyard outside, several houses might share a single water pump and a small number of toilets. Waste accumulated. Washing hung between walls that blocked the sunlight. Smoke from domestic fires mixed with the air from nearby workshops. In wet weather, mud gathered underfoot. In hot weather, smells lingered. Disease moved easily through such places. Yet these houses were not simply symbols of misery. They were homes. People cooked meals, raised children, exchanged news, argued, laughed, borrowed coal, washed one another's babies, and helped neighbors through illness or unemployment. Community could be strong because separation was almost impossible, but the same closeness that encouraged solidarity could also create conflict. A dispute over noise, drink, debt, insults, romance, or territory could spill into the courtyard. A family feud could become a street feud. Boys grew up knowing exactly which group controlled which corner, which public house welcomed which men, and which road became dangerous after dark. In districts such as Small Heath, Bordesley, Aston, Netchells, Cheapside, Darrowton, and parts of central Birmingham, the industrial city was experienced at ground level not through civic buildings and proud speeches, but through long hours, uncertain wages, and the endless rhythm of labor. A worker might begin before sunrise. The factory whistle, the workshop bell, or the habits of the household decided the morning. Men entered metal shops where heat and noise exhausted the body. Women worked in factories, workshops, homes, laundries, domestic service, and small trades. Children carried materials, polished objects, worked machinery, ran messages, or earned coins in jobs that exposed them to dust, chemicals, sharp tools, and heavy equipment. Birmingham's industries demanded skill, but skill did not always guarantee comfort. Some workers were proud craftsmen with control over their labor. Others survived through irregular employment, hired when orders were strong and dismissed when demand fell. A family could move from modest security to crisis after an injury, a death, a downturn in trade, or a few weeks without wages. Industrial accidents were common enough to become part of ordinary fear. A hand caught in machinery could end a career. Metal fragments could blind. Dust damaged lungs. Acids burned skin. Furnaces scorched. Repetitive work weakened bodies over years. There was no modern safety net waiting beneath every household. A man unable to work might depend on relatives, charity, the pawnshop, the parish, or the workhouse. A widow with children faced an especially dangerous future. Rent still had to be paid. Food still had to be found. Coal still had to be bought in winter. The pawnshop became part of the weekly economy. A family might pawn clothing or household goods early in the week and redeem them after wages were paid. Respectability could hang on a small ticket. Possessions moved in and out of the home, according to the timing of income. Credit also mattered. Shopkeepers knew customers personally. Debts were written in ledgers. A missed payment could become an embarrassment, then a crisis, then a confrontation. This was the environment in which illegal economies found space to grow. Crime did not appear because every poor person was criminal. The overwhelming majority of Birmingham's working people labored, raised families, and endured hardship without joining gangs. Poverty does not automatically create violence, and wealth does not prevent it. But deprivation can narrow choices. Crowded streets can make territorial identity powerful. Weak institutions can leave room for informal authority. When legitimate work is insecure and small illegal profits appear close at hand, some people will take the risk. For a boy growing up in a back court, the street was more than a path between buildings. It was a stage, a school, a marketplace, and sometimes a battlefield. Children learned quickly who was respected and who was vulnerable. They saw men return from factories exhausted. They saw drink change tempers. They saw police officers arrive after fights. They watched older youths dress carefully, walk confidently, and command attention. A gang could offer what the city often failed to provide: identity, protection, excitement, companionship, and a reputation. It could also demand violence in return. Long before the Peaky Blinders became famous, Birmingham already had groups known as slogging gangs. The word suggested striking, fighting, and physical force. These gangs were associated with districts and streets. Their members fought rivals, intimidated residents, disrupted public spaces, and sometimes challenged the police directly. Street fighting was not always random. Territory mattered. So did pride. A perceived insult to one member could bring retaliation from several others. Public houses became meeting places. Music halls, fairgrounds, boxing contests, and crowded street corners brought young men together. Rival groups learned one another's faces. Weapons were often simple and close at hand. Belts with heavy buckles, boots, sticks, knives, stones, bricks, metal tools, objects taken from workshops or picked up from the street. A fight could begin with words and end with a fractured skull. The police were expected to control this world, but Victorian policing in Birmingham was still developing. The city had not possessed a modern regular force for most of its earlier growth. In the summer of 1839, political unrest and rioting forced local authorities to seek outside help. Metropolitan police officers came from London, and later that year Birmingham established its own police force. The new constables entered a city where many residents did not automatically welcome them. To respectable property owners and civic leaders, the police promised order. To some working people, they represented interference, surveillance, and the authority of men who often seemed more concerned with street behavior than with the conditions that produced desperation. A Victorian constable walked long distances in uniform, usually without the technology modern officers take for granted. There was no radio on his shoulder, no motor vehicle waiting nearby. Help might be several streets away. At night, lamps revealed only fragments of the road. Fog, smoke, narrow alleys, and unfamiliar courtyards created places where a lone officer could be surrounded within seconds. The constable carried authority, but authority depended on the willingness of the crowd to recognize it. In some neighborhoods, that willingness was weak. Gangs discovered that attacking an officer could create prestige. The practice became known as constable baiting. One man provoked the confrontation. Others gathered. An attempted arrest turned into a struggle. A struggle turned into a mob attack. The uniform became a target. This did not mean every district was permanently lawless, nor did it mean police never entered poor neighborhoods. But officers understood that certain streets required caution, especially after closing time, especially when drink had been flowing, and especially when a known gang was nearby. A public house was one of the central institutions of working-class Birmingham. It offered warmth, light, conversation, alcohol, news, entertainment, and a place to conduct business. Wages could be spent there. Bets could be arranged there. Debts could be collected there. Friendships were strengthened and grudges sharpened. For men whose homes were crowded, the pub offered space. For gang members, it offered privacy hidden inside noise. The city's relationship with alcohol was complicated. Beer was part of daily life. Public houses were social centers. But drunkenness also fueled disorder, domestic suffering, workplace absence, and street violence. Temperance campaigners warned that drink destroyed families. Publicans argued that their houses served communities. Police watched the doors at closing time, knowing that arguments often emerged into the street. It was in this Birmingham, during the final decades of the 19th century, that the name Peaky Blinders began to appear. One of the earliest widely cited newspaper references followed a brutal attack in Small Heath in 1890. A young man named George Eastwood entered a public house and ordered ginger beer rather than alcohol. That small choice, or perhaps the way it was interpreted by the men around him, drew unwanted attention. When Eastwood left, he was followed and attacked by a group. He was beaten and kicked so severely that he required weeks of hospital treatment. Reports described his attackers as members of the Small Heath Peaky Blinders gang. The name had entered the record. But what exactly did it mean? The answer is not as certain as legend suggests. The most famous explanation claims that gang members stitched razor blades into the peaks of their flat caps and used the caps as weapons, slashing an opponent's face and blinding him with blood. It is a powerful image. It is also disputed. Disposable razor blades were not cheap, common objects in the period when the name first appeared. Historians have therefore questioned whether the practice could have given the gang its original name. Straight razors existed, and sharp objects could certainly be hidden in clothing, but the familiar story may have grown later, shaped by memory and dramatic retelling. Another explanation is simpler. The gang wore peaked caps pulled low over one eye, creating a partially blinded appearance. In Birmingham slang, a well-dressed or striking person could also be called a blinder. The name may therefore have referred not to a secret weapon, but to style, a peaked cap worn by a man who wanted to be noticed. There are also later recollections that coins, pieces of slate, or blades might sometimes have been inserted into caps to add weight. Such memories cannot always be confirmed, and they may describe later behavior rather than the origin of the name. The uncertainty matters. It reminds us that the real Peaky Blinders existed partly in fact and partly in reputation. A feared name grows larger as people repeat it. A story passes from witness to newspaper, from newspaper to memory, from memory to popular culture. Each retelling sharpens the image. The real gang members did not need razor caps to be dangerous. Their boots, belts, fists, knives, and numbers were enough. And their clothing served another purpose. It announced who they believed themselves to be. Clothing could transform a young man who possessed very little. A carefully chosen cap, scarf, jacket, waistcoat, or pair of boots created a visible identity. The effect was strongest in a world where most people owned few clothes and where garments carried clear messages about occupation, income, ambition, and respectability. A factory worker might spend his day in dirt and heat, then appear in the evening with polished boots and a bright scarf. A gang member could imitate the confidence of a gentleman while making the style his own. The clothes did not erase poverty, but for a few hours, they could conceal it. This may be one reason the image endured. The real Peaky Blinders were remembered not only because they fought, but because they looked as though they had prepared to be remembered. Some photographs preserved in police collections show young men in heavy coats and flat caps, staring into the camera with expressions that modern viewers find strangely familiar. Yet these were not portraits commissioned to celebrate criminal power. They were mugshots. The camera belonged to the state. Among the names associated with the Peaky Blinder world were Harry Fowles, Ernest Bales, and Stephen McNichol. Their offenses were often far less dramatic than the mythology surrounding them. Theft, burglary, disorder, carrying weapons, and violence appeared more often than complex criminal conspiracies. This is one of the most important differences between the real gang and the fictional empire later built from its name. The original Peaky Blinders were street criminals. They were not yet the directors of a national organization. They did not control Parliament. They did not command an army of bookmakers across Britain. They were dangerous because they were local, unpredictable, and willing to use force over matters that could appear small to outsiders. A bicycle theft could lead to prison. A pub insult could lead to a beating. A struggle with police could lead to death. Many gang members were young. Some entered the courts while still in their teens. One documented Birmingham offender associated with the period was arrested for carrying a firearm at only 13. Such cases reveal how early the street could begin shaping a life. A boy who received his first conviction might return from custody with fewer opportunities than before. Employers could reject him. Police could recognize him. Respectable neighbors could avoid him. Old companions might be the only group still willing to welcome him. Punishment was intended to break the criminal path, but it could also deepen it. Victorian prisons emphasized discipline, silence, labor, and obedience. A prisoner might spend long hours alone, perform repetitive work, follow strict rules, and experience a system designed to make crime physically and morally costly. For some, the experience frightened them away from further offending. For others, it hardened resentment. It also connected offenders to wider criminal networks. Names were exchanged. Reputations traveled. A young street fighter could learn how theft, receiving stolen property, betting, and protection operated beyond his own district. The courts saw only moments from lives that were usually more complicated. A man described as a violent rough might also be a son handing wages to his mother. A thief might work honestly for months before losing employment. A gang member might protect one neighbor and terrorize another. Human beings rarely fit the clean categories created by legend. That does not excuse their violence. The romantic image of the Peaky Blinder can easily hide the people who suffered at their hands. Victims were often ordinary residents with no power and no connection to rival gangs. A passerby could be insulted, robbed, or beaten simply for entering the wrong street. Publicans could be intimidated. Witnesses could be threatened. Women could experience harassment and violence. Families could live in fear of men whom popular culture would later dress in heroic shadows. The gang's victims did not hear a dramatic soundtrack. They heard boots running behind them. They saw a group blocking the road. They felt the uncertainty of whether a demand for money would end with payment or with blood. Newspapers sometimes described attacks in language intended to shock respectable readers. Reports of ruffianism turned poor districts into places of mystery and fear for people who never entered them. This reporting could exaggerate the idea of entire neighborhoods as criminal, but the violence itself was real. The relationship between newspapers and gangs became a cycle. The press gave gang names wider recognition. Recognition made those names useful. A youth who called himself a Peaky Blinder borrowed fear created by earlier men. The title could spread beyond one specific group and become a general label for a Birmingham street tough. That wider use makes the history difficult to reconstruct. When a newspaper called someone a Peaky Blinder, did it mean he belonged to a formal gang with known leaders and rules? Did it mean he dressed in a particular way? Did it simply mean he was a violent young man from a poor district? At different times, it may have meant all three. The real world was not organized like a membership book. Groups formed around streets, families, workplaces, pubs, and friendships. Alliances shifted. Men joined a fight without joining a permanent organization. A feared individual might gather companions for one purpose, then disappear into ordinary employment for weeks. Names also overlapped. Sloggers did not vanish on the day Peaky Blinders appeared. Older terms continued. New labels spread. A district could contain several groups whose boundaries were understood locally, but never clearly recorded by officials. The police often met this fluid world during moments of disorder. An officer saw the crowd, the weapon, the prisoner, and the injury. He might know the names of several regular offenders, but he did not always see the private loyalties that had brought them together. Constable George Snipe's death in 1897 became one of the most serious examples of the danger. He had been called to disorder near the Star Public House in Bridge Street West. A man was arrested. The officers began to move away. Then the crowd attacked in an effort to free the prisoner. A brick struck Snipe's temple. He was taken for treatment, but the injury was fatal. The killing exposed the weakness of an officer standing before a hostile crowd. It also created public anger. A policeman had been murdered while performing an ordinary duty. Newspapers demanded action. Respectable citizens asked how gangs had become confident enough to attack the law in the open street. George Williams, known by the nickname Cloggy, was eventually convicted of manslaughter in connection with Snipe's death and received a life sentence. The case entered the history of the Peaky Blinder era, though the exact boundaries between a named gang, a local crowd, and the wider culture of street violence were never as simple as later retellings would suggest. For years later, another Birmingham constable, Charles Philip Gunter, was killed during an encounter with violent men. His death reinforced the sense that the city's police were facing more than isolated drunken fights. They were facing a challenge to authority. For residents, however, the police could represent both protection and pressure. A shopkeeper whose window had been smashed wanted stronger patrols. A mother whose son was being drawn into a gang might welcome intervention. A worker stopped repeatedly because of his appearance might see the constable differently. Police decisions were shaped by class assumptions, local prejudice, and the moral standards of the time. Officers enforced laws against theft and assault, but also watched gambling, drinking, public behavior, and street gatherings. The same force that protected a vulnerable resident could enter a poor household in search of a betting slip. Trust varied from street to street. Gang members exploited that division. Witnesses were often reluctant to speak. Some feared revenge. Others disliked the police. Some had relatives involved in crime. Some depended on an illegal bookmaker or local strongman for loans, favors, or protection. Silence made prosecution difficult. A man could be attacked before several people and still find that no one had seen anything clearly. This code of silence was not unique to Birmingham. It appears wherever official authority is weak, distrusted, or dangerous to cooperate with. But in crowded working-class districts, where everyone knew where everyone else lived, the cost of giving evidence could be immediate. Police. Intelligence, therefore, depended heavily on familiarity. A constable learned faces, nicknames, family ties, and and habits. He knew which men stood outside which pub. He noticed when a known thief suddenly wore better clothes. He listened to rumors. He watched pawnshops and lodging houses. He spoke with informants who might provide information for money, revenge, or protection. The criminal world watched back. Gang members learned patrol patterns. They recognized plainclothes officers. They knew which constables could be intimidated, which could be bribed, and which would keep returning no matter how many times they were threatened. The struggle was personal. Before fingerprints became widely useful and before modern communications connected stations, identification relied on memory, descriptions, records, photographs, and the knowledge of experienced officers. A criminal could move to another district and become less visible. He could use a false name. He could change clothing. But a face recorded in a mugshot might follow him. Photography slowly changed policing. The camera fixed an image that could be stored, compared, and circulated. It reduced the power of disguise. It also created the haunting visual archive through which the real Peaky Blinders are known today. Those photographs invite modern viewers to imagine stories. A young man looks directly at the lens. His cap sits at an angle. His coat collar rises around his neck. Perhaps he appears calm. Perhaps defiant. Perhaps simply tired. The image offers no sound. It does not tell us whether his mother waited outside the court. It does not describe the victim of his offense. It does not reveal whether he regretted anything. It does not say whether he later returned to ordinary work, emigrated, died young, or disappeared into a Birmingham that was changing around him. The silence of the photograph is one reason mythology enters so easily. We fill the empty space. We give the man a voice, a plan, a family empire, and a destiny. But history must resist the temptation to make every criminal into a mastermind. The power of the real story lies elsewhere. It lies in understanding how the city produced repeated waves of street gangs, why fashion became a form of intimidation, why police reform changed the balance of power, and how illegal betting transformed local roughs into national criminal entrepreneurs. The Peaky Blinders were one stage in that development. They grew from a culture of district gangs that had existed since at least the middle decades of the 19th century. Their world was physical. Reputation was defended face to face. Violence happened in streets, pubs, courtyards, and alleys. Money came from theft, robbery, intimidation, protection, and gambling on a limited scale. The next generation would think bigger. It would follow the railway lines out of Birmingham. It would look toward racecourses filled with thousands of spectators and bookmakers carrying large amounts of cash. It would learn that controlling a street brought fear, but controlling betting brought wealth. Before that transformation could happen, however, the old gangs had to lose their hold. And the man chosen to weaken them arrived in Birmingham in 1899. His name was Charles Houghton Rafter. Charles Houghton Rafter came to Birmingham from the Royal Irish Constabulary, an organization shaped by a very different political and social environment. He had spent years policing districts where public order, political tension, and local loyalty could make authority difficult to enforce. When he applied to become Birmingham's chief constable in 1899, there were many candidates. Rafter appeared before the city's watch committee in uniform. The gesture impressed them. It suggested discipline, seriousness, and confidence. He was appointed to lead a force that was already struggling to match the size of the city. Birmingham had hundreds of officers, but not enough for a population approaching 500,000. Stations were spread across a rapidly expanding urban area. Some neighborhoods had grown faster than patrol arrangements. Experienced constables carried enormous local knowledge, yet training and standards were uneven. Rafter believed the answer was not simply more punishment after crimes occurred. He wanted a larger, more professional, better educated force built around prevention. New recruits were added. Training became more systematic. Officers studied law, procedure, arithmetic, writing, first aid, physical exercise, and practical methods of dealing with the public. Discipline was strengthened. Communication improved. The force became more capable of moving officers where trouble was expected rather than arriving only after the street had exploded. This mattered because gang violence depended on imbalance. A group of 20 young men could overwhelm 1 or 2 constables. But a coordinated police response changed the calculation. If reinforcements arrived quickly, if known offenders were watched closely, if courts imposed heavier sentences, Then the public display of gang power became more costly. Rafters reforms did not eliminate crime. No chief constable could erase poverty, alcohol abuse, unstable work, or the attraction of street status. Nor was policing under his command free from controversy or force. Victorian and Edwardian police methods could be harsh, and public order operations sometimes injured innocent people. But the old slogging gangs began to face sustained pressure. The city increased the number of officers. Police gathered better information. Courts became less tolerant of repeated gang offending. Young men who once expected a short sentence could find themselves removed from Birmingham for years. The balance shifted slowly. Street gangs depended on visibility. Their reputation had to be demonstrated in public. But public violence created witnesses, newspaper attention, and police response. The very acts that made a gang feared also made it vulnerable. As the new century began, some of the most notorious district groups weakened. Men aged out of street fighting, entered stable work, moved away, enlisted, married, died, or went to prison. Younger boys still formed groups, but the city around them was changing. Birmingham itself was becoming more organized. Public health reforms improved water, sanitation, and housing regulation, though progress was uneven and many back-to-backs survived for decades. Streets were widened. Municipal government expanded. Education reached more children. Transport connected outlying districts. Electric light gradually transformed nighttime spaces. The city remained unequal, smoky, and crowded, but it was no longer quite the same Birmingham in which the early sloggers had flourished. The name Peaky Blinder continued to appear, sometimes as a specific identity and sometimes as a general insult for a violent, stylish young rough. Yet by the first decade of the 20th century, the most intense period of the original gang culture was passing. This did not mean Birmingham's underworld was disappearing. It was learning to make money more efficiently. At the center of that change was betting. Britain had a long and complicated relationship with gambling. People wagered on cards, dice, fights, elections, animal contests, and almost any uncertain event that could hold attention. Horse racing, however, became the great national theater of betting. Racing brought together aristocrats, workers, professional gamblers, bookmakers, thieves, tourists, and gangsters. On a race day, social classes that lived far apart entered the same crowded space. The wealthy watched from privileged enclosures. Ordinary spectators filled cheaper areas. Vendors shouted. Horses moved through paddocks. Trains arrived packed with people. Bookmakers stood among the crowds calling odds and taking bets. Large amounts of cash changed hands quickly. That cash attracted protection. It also attracted predators. Betting law was full of contradictions. The state tried to restrict gambling, especially off-course betting among the working classes, while allowing horse racing to remain a respected national institution. The Betting Act of 1853 targeted betting houses, pushing much wagering into streets, pubs, factories, private rooms, and informal networks. A worker who could not attend a racecourse still wanted to place a small bet. The street bookmaker filled that demand. He might stand near a factory gate, operate from the back room of a pub, send runners through neighborhoods, or accept bets through trusted intermediaries. Customers paid coins and received slips or verbal confirmation. Results arrived through newspapers, telegraph messages, runners, and rumor. The business relied on trust because much of it existed outside legal protection. If a bookmaker refused to pay, the customer could not always seek help from the law. If a customer failed to settle a debt, the bookmaker needed another method of collection. If a rival opened nearby, territory became important. This created opportunities for men willing to use force. A local gang could protect a bookmaker from robbery, collect debts, remove competitors, intimidate witnesses, and warn of police activity. In return, the bookmaker paid money or offered access to information and influence. The relationship between gambling and gangs was therefore natural. Betting generated cash. Illegality generated vulnerability. Violence offered enforcement. Police raids could disrupt the business, but demand remained enormous. Closing one betting room often moved the operation to another street. Arresting one runner created a vacancy for someone else. The Street Betting Act of 1906 increased penalties and sought to suppress betting in public places. Yet the law did not end working-class gambling. It pushed the system further into concealment. Bookmakers adapted. Some used lookouts. Some changed locations. Some accepted bets through factories or clubs. Some relied on women and children as messengers because they attracted less suspicion. Some built relationships with corrupt officers or paid for warnings. The small betting slip became part of a wider economy. A few pennies wagered on a horse might offer excitement in a week defined by routine. A win promised temporary escape. A loss could be explained as bad luck rather than low wages. Racing columns gave workers a subject to debate. Form, weight, weather, jockeys, and odds became knowledge shared across class lines. For most bettors, the stake was small. For organized criminals, the total was not. Thousands of small bets created a river of money. The man who controlled the points where that river passed could become powerful. Racecourses offered even greater opportunity. Unlike a hidden street operation, the racecourse gathered bookmakers and cash in one place. A bookmaker might carry enough money to pay winning customers. He needed a good position from which to trade. He needed room for clerks and assistants. He needed protection from thieves and from rival gangs that might demand payment for allowing him to work. The crowds were dense enough to conceal violence. An argument could disappear into movement. A victim could be surrounded. A bookmaker who resisted a protection demand might be jostled, beaten, or driven from his pitch. His equipment could be damaged. His money could vanish. Police were present, but race meetings created difficult conditions. Thousands of spectators moved across open ground. Offenders traveled from different cities. Witnesses left by train before an investigation began. The railway made racecourse crime national. A gang no longer had to remain in one Birmingham district. Its members could board a train, arrive at a meeting in another county, enforce an agreement, and return home the same evening. The skills of the street were exported. So were the loyalties. A Birmingham gang could recruit fighters from several neighborhoods. It could arrange transportation. It could form alliances with local groups elsewhere. It could study the racing calendar and plan where men would be needed. This required organization beyond the old street corner. Someone had to know the schedule. Someone had to negotiate with bookmakers. Someone had to distribute money. Someone had to decide when to threaten, when to attack, and when to retreat. The rise of racecourse racketeering therefore favored leaders who could think like businessmen without abandoning violence. Billy Kimber was one of those men. William Kimber was born in 1882 in the Summer Lane area of Aston, Birmingham. His background was working class. He trained or worked as a brass caster, a trade rooted in the metal industries that defined the city. The brass foundry belonged to the world of heat, fumes, skill, and physical endurance. Molten metal was poured into molds. The work demanded attention because a mistake could burn or maim. It was honest labor, but it offered no guarantee of security or advancement. Kimber grew up during the height of Birmingham's gang culture. He would have known the reputation of sloggers and Peaky Blinders. He would have understood how district loyalty operated, how men were recruited, and how fear could be turned into obedience. But Kimber's ambition extended beyond a few streets. The organization that formed around him became known as the Birmingham Gang, the Birmingham Boys, or the Brummagem Boys, using an old slang name for the city. The exact shape of the gang changed over time. It was not a modern corporation with a fixed payroll and written structure. It was a network of bookmakers, fighters, collectors, transport arrangements, allies, and local leaders. Kimber's power came from connecting these pieces. He built influence on racecourses in the Midlands and the North. Men associated with his network appeared at meetings where bookmakers understood that access and safety could depend on cooperation. Protection was presented as a service. The threat that made the service necessary often came from the same people offering it. A bookmaker paid to avoid trouble. If he refused, trouble arrived. Once he paid, the gang could claim to be protecting him from thieves and rival groups. The arrangement blurred robbery and security until they became almost the same thing. Kimber's men did not need to own the racecourse. They needed to control enough of the space around betting to influence who could operate and under what conditions. Violence remained essential, but selective violence was more useful than constant chaos. A public beating could send a message to dozens of witnesses. One bookmaker driven from a pitch warned others. Reputation reduced the number of attacks required. This was organized crime in a form suited to early 20th century Britain. It was mobile. It followed legitimate business. It exploited legal uncertainty. It used modern transport. And it depended on men whose roots lay in the older street gangs. The difference was scale. A Peaky Blinder might dominate a corner. Billy Kimber wanted the racing circuit. To build that power, he needed partners beyond Birmingham. London offered both opportunity and danger. The capital contained enormous crowds, wealthy race meetings, established bookmakers, and criminal organizations with their own territories. Kimber created a base in Islington and worked with figures such as Charles MacDonald, known as Wag MacDonald. Alliances connected the Birmingham network with London groups, including men associated with the Hoxton and Elephant and Castle gangs. These arrangements were practical rather than permanent. Each group brought local knowledge and manpower. Birmingham supplied disciplined fighters and racecourse experience. London allies offered access, contacts, and protection in the capital. Together, they could pressure bookmakers across a wider region. But expansion created enemies. Among those who resisted were bookmakers and criminal figures from London's East End, including Jewish bookmakers who faced intimidation on racecourses. They sought protection from local underworld leaders. That response helped bring another powerful network into the conflict. The name most closely associated with it was Sabini. Charles Darby Sabini, known widely as Darby Sabini, came from a family of mixed Italian and English background. His organization drew strength from London communities, boxing connections, nightclub security, and racecourse protection. The coming struggle was not a simple contest between two men. It involved shifting alliances, ethnic tensions, local loyalties, bookmakers, hired fighters, and gangs from several districts. Yet Kimber and Sabini became symbols of the opposing sides. The old Birmingham street world had now entered a national racecourse war, and the weapons were no longer only belts and boots. By the years before the First World War, the criminal economy surrounding racing had become more sophisticated than the street gangs of the 1890s. Information mattered as much as muscle. A bookmaker needed results quickly. A gang needed to know which meetings would attract the largest crowds, which bookmakers carried the most money, where police were stationed, and which rival groups were expected to appear. Railway timetables became tools of business. Men traveled in groups, sometimes carrying ordinary luggage and dressed like racegoers. Their purpose might not become clear until they reached the betting ring. Once there, they could spread through the crowd, identify targets, and gather again when force was needed. Money moved through layers. A bettor gave coins to a runner. The runner carried the bet to a bookmaker or intermediary. Clerks recorded names, horses, and stakes. Collectors gathered debts. Protectors watched the operation. Leaders received shares. Every layer created the possibility of theft. A runner could disappear with the money. A clerk could alter a record. A collector could claim that a customer had not paid. A bookmaker could deny a winning bet. Trust, therefore, depended on reputation, and reputation depended on the credible threat of consequence. Kimber's organization helped provide that consequence. His influence was not based on affection. It rested on the belief that an agreement made with his people would be enforced. To honest businessmen, such power was criminal intimidation. To those operating outside the law, it could appear as a form of order. This is a recurring pattern in organized crime. When an activity is illegal but widely demanded, the state does not fully regulate contracts, disputes, and payments. Criminal organizations step into the gap. They create rules, collect fees, punish violations, and claim territory. The rules may bring predictability, but they are backed by violence rather than consent. Racecourse gangs became unofficial authorities in a marketplace the law had forced partly underground. They did not create Britain's desire to gamble. They profited from it. The money could support a lifestyle that separated leaders from ordinary street fighters. Better clothes, better houses, travel, meals, and influence became possible. A successful gang leader did not need to stand in every fight. He could send men whose loyalty depended on payment and fear. This was closer to an enterprise than a neighborhood brotherhood. Yet the world remained unstable. A criminal leader could be wealthy one month and wounded the next. Alliances lasted only while interests overlapped. Police pressure could remove key men. A bookmaker who paid one gang might be approached by another. Violence settled arguments that no court would hear. For the original Peaky Blinders, this new world was difficult to dominate. Their names still carried local meaning, But the center of criminal power was moving away from scattered street gangs and toward networks that could control money across distance. Some men from the older culture may have joined or supported the Birmingham boys. Others withdrew. The transition was gradual, and records do not allow every individual path to be traced. What is clear is that Billy Kimber, not a Shelby, became the most important Birmingham criminal leader of the period. His success also exposes one of the great ironies of the popular legend. The fictional Tommy Shelby is presented as a brilliant newcomer who defeats Billy Kimber after the First World War. Historically, Kimber's organization was the force that overshadowed the earlier Peaky Blinder world. He was not destroyed by them. He inherited the city's culture of violence, expanded it, and turned it toward the national betting economy. Then Europe went to war. In August 1914, Britain entered the First World War. Birmingham's factories became part of the national war machine. The city produced weapons, ammunition, vehicles, equipment, and countless components needed by the armed forces. Industry expanded under extraordinary pressure. Men enlisted or were conscripted. Women entered jobs previously closed to them. Workshops ran long hours. The rhythms of the city changed. Streets filled with uniforms, recruitment appeals, casualty news, and anxiety. Gang members were not outside this transformation. Some joined the armed forces. Some worked in protected industries. Some continued criminal activity. Some died in France or returned wounded. The war disrupted old groups by removing young men from neighborhoods for years. It also trained millions in discipline, weapons, transport, and survival. The fictional story of Peaky Blinders begins with traumatized veterans returning to Birmingham in 1919. That setting is historically powerful even though the Shelby family is invented. Real veterans did return to a city that could not easily absorb them. They came home with memories that were rarely understood. Some had endured artillery bombardments, gas, mud, death, and years of military control. They returned to crowded houses, uncertain jobs, and families altered by absence. The language of trauma was limited. Men were expected to resume ordinary life. Some did. Others struggled with nightmares, anger, physical disability, alcohol, or a sense that civilian concerns had become unreal. The war did not create British organized crime, but it changed the people and conditions within which crime operated. Weapons circulated. Military surplus could be stolen or sold. Men who had driven vehicles, handled explosives, or organized supplies possessed useful skills. Demobilization brought large numbers home within a short period. Labor conflict intensified as workers demanded better wages and conditions after wartime sacrifice. Birmingham experienced these tensions alongside the rest of Britain. The city had gained industrial importance, but workers faced inflation and housing shortages. Women who had filled wartime roles were often expected to surrender jobs to returning men. Families mourned the dead. Disabled veterans confronted a future in which public gratitude did not always provide private security. Meanwhile, racing resumed its place in national life. Crowds returned to racecourses. Betting money flowed again. Criminal networks reorganized. For Billy Kimber and his allies, the post-war period offered enormous opportunity. The railway system remained the backbone of movement. Motor vehicles were becoming more available. Telephone communication improved. Newspapers spread racing information. Large urban populations supported illegal betting. The scale of organized crime increased because the scale of modern life increased. A gang could now coordinate across cities more effectively than a generation earlier. Kimber's Birmingham men became known for arriving in force. They were not simply pickpockets blending into the crowd. Their power depended on being recognized. A group could occupy space around bookmakers, demand payment, and make resistance appear dangerous. Racecourse protection operated through a mixture of intimidation and genuine defense. Bookmakers faced thieves known for grabbing cash or betting bags. They also faced rival protection gangs. Paying Kimber's men could reduce one danger while creating dependency on another. The gang sometimes presented itself as defending bookmakers against disorder. In practice, it controlled access to protection. To understand the attraction of this system, imagine a bookmaker standing in a betting ring with cash collected from hundreds of customers. He cannot close his business every time a threat appears. He cannot rely on a police officer remaining beside him all day. If a group attacks, the crowd may scatter. Even if arrests follow, his money may be gone. A permanent criminal protector offers immediate force. The price is submission. Once enough bookmakers pay, the gang gains resources to recruit more men. More men create a stronger reputation. A stronger reputation persuades more bookmakers to pay without resistance. Power expands through fear before violence is even used. Kimber's organization became one of the largest of its kind in Britain. His influence reached from the Midlands into northern England and toward London. For a period, he may have been the most significant organized crime leader in the country. Yet national expansion brought him into direct conflict with men who believed the southern racecourses belonged to them. Darby Sabini's network had its own structure and mythology. Sabini was connected to London's underworld, to boxing, clubs, bookmakers, and local communities. His men were often described in ethnic terms by newspapers and rivals, sometimes with open prejudice. The conflict between the Birmingham and London groups was therefore reported not only as a criminal struggle, but as a clash between outsiders and locals, Englishmen and Italians, Northerners and Londoners. Such descriptions simplified a much more mixed reality. Gang alliances crossed ethnic and neighborhood lines whenever profit required it. Kimber worked with London criminals. Sabini's network included men of varied backgrounds. Bookmakers shifted protection according to necessity, but identity was useful in mobilizing violence. A gang could portray a business dispute as defensive community. Men who might not risk prison for a bookmaker's profit could be persuaded to fight for local honor or ethnic loyalty. The racecourse wars were therefore about money, but never only money. They were also about humiliation. A leader who allowed his men to be attacked without response appeared weak. A gang driven from a course lost more than income. It lost reputation. Retaliation became necessary even when it risked police attention. The conflict intensified after the war. Ambushes were planned. Men were beaten in streets and railway stations. Vehicles followed targets. Revolvers appeared. Hammers, hatchets, knives, and heavy objects turned sudden attacks into scenes of terror. The gangs understood that killing could bring the full force of the state, so violence often remained just below that line. The goal was to disable, frighten, and dominate. But once dozens of armed men entered a fight, control became impossible. The national press began to report racecourse gang warfare with growing alarm. Respectable readers discovered that organized groups were traveling openly across Britain to fight over gambling profits. The violence challenged the comforting belief that serious organized crime belonged only to foreign cities or sensational fiction. Britain had its own underworld. It wore flat caps and traveled by train. The government and police could not ignore the problem indefinitely. Racecourses were economically important and socially prestigious. Violence among bookmakers threatened wealthy spectators as well as working-class bettors. This distinction mattered. Street gang violence in poor Birmingham neighborhoods had troubled authorities for decades, but it was often treated as a local moral problem. Once the same culture entered racecourses attended by influential people, national attention increased. Organized crime had crossed a boundary. It had left the back court and entered the grandstand. The turning point came in 1921, when the struggle between Kimber's Birmingham alliance and Sabini's supporters erupted into a series of attacks that exposed the entire system. One incident began at a trotting track in Greenford, west of London. The Birmingham side targeted Sabini and his associates. Details differ between accounts, as they often do in gang conflicts, but Sabini was assaulted and the rivalry escalated. Soon afterward, Billy Kimber himself went to meet Sabini in London. Kimber was found badly beaten and shot. He survived. His survival did not end the matter. It demanded revenge. What followed would become one of the most notorious episodes in the history of British racecourse gangs. It took place on the road near Epsom. On a race day in June 1921, a vehicle carrying bookmakers from Leeds traveled near Ewell, not far from Epsom. The men inside had become associated, rightly or wrongly, with the side opposing Kimber's Birmingham organization. To the gang waiting for them, that connection was enough. The attack was planned with vehicles rather than chance. A taxi was used to force or block the target. Other men arrived in a motor coach. The bookmakers found themselves surrounded by a large group carrying hammers, sticks, bricks, hatchets, and at least one firearm. The road became a battlefield. Windows shattered. Men were dragged, struck, and chased. Confusion spread so quickly that early reports struggled to explain what had happened. Some observers believed they were witnessing political violence connected to Ireland because armed groups and organized vehicles suggested something larger than an ordinary criminal assault. In reality, the battle was part of the racecourse war. The attackers had mistaken, targeted, or deliberately punished men they believed belonged to the rival protection network. The exact motives of every participant were impossible to separate once the violence began. What mattered was the scale. This was not a fight between two bookmakers. Dozens of men had traveled with the intention of using coordinated force. Vehicles had been arranged. Weapons had been carried. Escape had been planned. The police response was unusually large. Officers traced the motor coach and gathered evidence linking suspects to the attack. Arrests followed. Eventually, more than 20 men connected with the Birmingham side were brought before the courts in what became known as the Epsom Road Battle case. The trial damaged Kimber's organization in a way that a rival gang could not. Street power depends on manpower. When many experienced fighters are imprisoned at the same time, territory becomes difficult to defend. Bookmakers begin to doubt whether protection can still be delivered. Allies reconsider agreements. Rivals move into the empty space. The sentences also sent a message. Racecourse violence was no longer being treated as a collection of small assaults hidden in a crowd. The state had recognized an organized conspiracy. The press followed the proceedings closely. Readers learned about taxis, motor coaches, weapons, bribery allegations, and the hidden business of protection. The image of the criminal gang changed again. The Victorian Peaky Blinder had been imagined as a young rough haunting a dark street. The racecourse gangster was modern. He used transport, schedules, communications, and national networks. He could appear in one county and disappear into another. He operated beside legal entertainment, using the movement of ordinary people as camouflage. The Epsom case showed that police would have to modernize in response. Local forces needed to share information. Detectives needed photographs, names, addresses, vehicles, and associations. Railway stations and roads had to be watched. Criminals could no longer be understood only within the boundaries of one city. For Birmingham, the case marked the beginning of the end of Kimber's dominance in the South. Darby Sabini's organization gained the advantage on London and southeastern racecourses. The Birmingham boys remained active, but the balance had shifted. Kimber himself was not killed in a dramatic showdown. He survived the gang wars. Over time, he moved away from the violent center of the underworld and became more involved in legitimate bookmaking. By the later years of his life, he held a respectable position within a regional bookmakers association in southwest England. This transformation may seem surprising, but the border between legal and illegal betting was always complicated. A man could begin in street bookmaking, protection, or racecourse intimidation and later present himself as a recognized businessman. Money could be cleaned not only through false accounts, but through time. As memories faded and records remained scattered, a feared gang leader might become a quiet resident known for a different occupation. William Kimber died in 1945 at the age of 63 after a long illness. There was no Tommy Shelby standing over his body. There was no final gunshot in Small Heath. Illness, age, and death in a nursing home. Yet the organization he built changed British crime. Kimber demonstrated how a gang rooted in Birmingham street culture could become a national enterprise. He connected local violence to modern transport and mass gambling. He helped create a model that others would follow in different industries and different cities. Protection became a business. Territory could be mobile. Reputation could travel farther than the men who created it. The Sabini organization that defeated Kimber in the South would also face decline. Police attention increased. Racecourses strengthened regulation and security. Bookmakers organized collectively. The state developed better methods for tracking mobile criminals. Immigration status and wartime politics later affected some members of Sabini's network. Internal rivalries weakened alliances. No criminal empire remains untouched by change. A gang rises because conditions favor it. Then those conditions shift. The old Peaky Blinders had flourished in overcrowded districts where police numbers were limited and street reputation mattered deeply. Rafters reforms, education, sentencing, and urban change weakened that environment. The Birmingham boys flourished when off-course betting was restricted, Racecourses concentrated cash, and railways allowed organized groups to travel quickly. Better policing and racecourse control weakened that opportunity. Criminal organizations adapt, but adaptation changes their identity. By the 1930s, British organized crime increasingly connected to clubs, nightlife, boxing, labor rackets, stolen goods, and new forms of gambling. Motor vehicles made movement faster. Telephones made communication easier. Firearms, though still less common than in American gang mythology, became more significant in certain conflicts. The underworld became less visible in some ways and more professional in others. A successful criminal no longer needed to dress like a street gang member or fight personally. He could own a business, employ intermediaries, cultivate officials, and present himself as respectable. The transformation mirrored Birmingham itself. The city that had grown through thousands of small workshops was becoming a center of larger industries, including motor manufacturing. Suburbs expanded. Old courts remained, but new housing drew families outward. Municipal boundaries grew. Transport connected neighborhoods that had once felt separate. Street identities did not disappear, but the physical landscape that produced the original gangs slowly changed. Back-to-back houses came under increasing criticism from public health reformers. New construction was restricted. Over the 20th century, many old courts were demolished. Families moved to council housing, suburbs, and later large estates. Demolition improved space and sanitation for many residents, but it also erased parts of the old social world. Courtyards where several generations had lived vanished beneath roads, offices, factories, and redevelopment. Pubs closed. Street names changed. Bombing during the Second World War damaged Birmingham, and post-war planners transformed the center again. Memory became detached from place. A person might remember that a grandfather had known a Peaky Blinder, but no longer be able to stand in the exact court where the story happened. Family tales survived even when buildings did not. This is how legends deepen, when documentary evidence is incomplete and physical evidence disappears. Oral history carries emotional truth. A grandparent remembers men in flat caps. A child hears that they kept razor blades in the peaks. Another family remembers silver coins piled on a table. The story passes forward, changing slightly with each voice. Historians approach such memories carefully. Written records are not perfect. Newspapers exaggerated. Police records reflected official assumptions. Court documents focused on offenses rather than everyday life. Working-class people often left fewer written accounts than officials and employers. Oral history can preserve experiences that institutions ignored, but memory also reshapes chronology. Events from different decades may merge. One gang's habits may be attributed to another. A later racecourse gangster can become an original Peaky Blinder. A general term can be remembered as the name of a single organization. The challenge is not to choose between memory and record as though one must be entirely false. The challenge is to understand what each can reveal. The records tell us that the name Peaky Blinders appeared in Birmingham newspapers by 1890. They show young men associated with theft, violence, disorder, and intimidation. They show attacks on police and civilians. They show a street culture rooted in particular districts. The memories tell us that the name lasted in popular speech longer than some formal histories once assumed. They tell us that style, fear, and family reputation mattered. They explain why the image remained powerful enough to inspire later fiction. Together, they produce a history that is less certain in detail but richer in meaning. Consider again the flat cap. It was an ordinary item worn by working men across Britain. In the Peaky Blinders story, it becomes a symbol of menace. The transformation happened because clothing is read through behavior. A cap pulled low by a laborer walking to work is simply a cap. The same cap worn by a group blocking a street becomes a uniform. Once fear attaches to it, every similar figure can appear threatening. The razor blade legend intensifies that symbolism. It turns an everyday object into a concealed weapon. Whether or not blades were commonly stitched into caps, the story expresses something true about the anxiety gangs created. Ordinary things could become dangerous without warning. A belt was clothing until its buckle struck a face. A boot was workwear until it kicked a man on the ground. A brick was part of the city until it killed Constable Snipe. Industrial Birmingham produced millions of useful objects. Its streets could transform those objects into weapons. The city also produced the wealth that stood in contrast to poverty. Birmingham's civic leaders celebrated progress. Grand buildings rose. Merchants gained fortunes. Political figures such as Joseph Chamberlain promoted municipal reform and the city's importance. Water systems, gas, public institutions, and urban improvements demonstrated confidence. Yet only a short walk from civic grandeur, families lived in overcrowded courts. This contrast shaped the emotional landscape of the gang era. Young men saw wealth near enough to observe, but far enough to feel unreachable. They saw employers, merchants, police officials, and gentlemen move through a city built partly by their labor. The gang offered a crude form of status in a world that granted them little official authority. Violence could make a poor man feared. Fashion could make him visible. Betting could make him briefly wealthy. But the cost was paid by the same communities from which he came. A gang did not redistribute industrial wealth in any meaningful sense. It took money from bookmakers, workers, shopkeepers, and vulnerable residents. It recruited young men who might otherwise have remained outside crime. It brought police raids and retaliation into crowded neighborhoods. The idea of the gangster as protector, therefore, deserves caution. Some criminals did provide favors. They lent money, settled disputes, helped relatives, and defended their own streets against outsiders. Such actions built loyalty. But protection offered by a man who also creates fear is not the same as public service. The real Peaky Blinders were not rebels leading the poor against an unjust system. They were products of that system who often preyed upon people with even less power than themselves. This truth makes their history darker than the romantic myth. It also makes it more human. They were not supernatural villains. They were young men making choices within difficult conditions. Understanding those conditions explains the choices without erasing responsibility. The same principle applies to the police. Officers were not simply heroic guardians or instruments of oppression. Many came from working-class backgrounds. They lived near the people they patrolled. They faced stones, knives, and crowds for modest pay. They also enforced laws that targeted working-class pleasures and sometimes used unnecessary force. The street encounter between gang and constable was therefore often a conflict between men whose social origins were not very different. One wore a uniform provided by the city. The other wore a cap that represented the street. Behind them stood competing forms of authority. The police claimed legitimacy from law. The gang claimed legitimacy from loyalty, reputation, and fear. Birmingham's transition into the 20th century was, in part, the story of the first authority slowly defeating the second. But only in public. Illegal betting remained. Crime moved indoors. Influence became quieter. To picture the world that produced these men, it helps to slow the story down and walk through Birmingham as an ordinary resident might have experienced it. Imagine waking before daylight in a court near Small Heath at the end of the 19th century. The room is cold. A thin fire has nearly gone out. Several people are sleeping close together because warmth is easier to keep when space is shared. Somewhere nearby, a baby begins to cry. A door opens into the courtyard. A bucket is carried outside. Water must be fetched before the day begins. The first sounds are domestic. A grate being cleaned. Boots placed on brick. A cough from the next house. Then the industrial city starts to wake. Carts move along the road. Factory gates open. Metal strikes metal. Steam escapes. A whistle announces that time now belongs to the employer. Workers leave in groups, carrying food wrapped for the day. Some walk only a short distance. Others cross several neighborhoods. Children old enough to earn money hurry beside adults. Women begin paid work inside and outside the home, while also carrying the greater burden of cooking, washing, cleaning, and caring for children. In a small workshop, the day may begin with tools laid out on a bench. Light enters through a dirty window. The worker repeats a precise movement hundreds of times. A piece is cut, stamped, polished, filed, drilled, soldered, or assembled. The finished object may be tiny, but its production fills the room with noise and dust. Birmingham's industrial greatness was built from such repetitions. A button passed through several hands. A pen nib moved from metal sheet to finished product through specialized tasks. A gun component made in one workshop joined parts made elsewhere. The city's economy depended on networks of subcontracting that connected grand manufacturers to small masters and home workers. This flexibility created opportunity, but it also shifted risk downward. When orders fell, the smallest workshops suffered first. When prices were cut, workers absorbed the loss. Families sometimes worked together because every pair of hands increased output. A child might learn a trade early, gaining skill and identity. The same child might lose education, health, and freedom. Reformers visited industrial districts and wrote reports about long hours, dangerous processes, and overcrowded homes. Their accounts helped bring new laws, but enforcement took time. Employers resisted rules they believed would increase costs. Families sometimes resisted restrictions on child labor because the lost wages could mean less food. The poor were forced to choose between harms created by conditions they did not control. Outside the workshops, commerce filled the streets. Market sellers arranged food and household goods. Hawkers called to passers-by. Rag and bone collectors searched for reusable material. Pawnbrokers opened their doors. Public houses prepared for customers. Newsboys carried the latest reports. The street bookmaker was part of this informal world. He did not always look like a criminal leader. He might be a familiar local man with a notebook, a good memory, and a network of runners. Customers trusted him because he had paid before. Police knew him because they had arrested him before. The business continued because fines could be treated as an operating cost. A small bet offered a story within the day. The horse had a name. The race had a time. The result would bring either disappointment or sudden excitement. Workers discussed tips over machinery, in yards, and at pub tables. Information arrived from newspapers and telegraph offices. A rumor from a stable could spread across Birmingham by noon. The bookmaker's runner moved quietly through this landscape. He collected coins and names, perhaps folding slips into pockets or hiding them inside clothing. A lookout warned when police approached. The operation could dissolve in seconds, leaving a street that appeared innocent. Women participated in the betting economy as customers, messengers, and operators, though official records often focused more heavily on men. A woman could carry slips under the assumption that police would search her less readily. A family might run betting from a room while presenting another trade at the front. Illegal business blended with ordinary life. This blending made it resilient. The police could raid a clearly marked den. They found it harder to eliminate a practice spread through homes, workplaces, pubs, and personal relationships. By midday, smoke settled over parts of the city. The air carried coal, hot metal, horse manure, cooking, waste, and the chemical odors of specialized trades. In winter, fog mixed with industrial pollution and reduced streets to shadows. Lamps glowed through darkness even before evening. For a constable, such conditions changed patrol into a test of memory. He recognized a doorway by shape, a public house by sound, an alley by the feel of the ground beneath his boots. He listened for sudden silence, because a street that became quiet at his approach might reveal more than shouting. Children watched him pass. Some mocked him from a safe distance. Some ran messages to warn older boys. Some saw the uniform as protection. The same child might hold all three feelings depending on the day. Schooling gradually changed childhood. Compulsory education expanded during the late Victorian period, bringing more children into classrooms and reducing the amount of time available for street life and labor. Attendance remained imperfect, but literacy increased. Education was one of the forces that weakened the old gang culture. A boy who could read, write, and calculate had more chances for skilled work or advancement. School also placed him under adult supervision during hours once spent in the street. Yet education alone did not remove deprivation. Crowded homes remained. Wages remained uncertain. Boys still sought excitement and belonging after school. Evening transformed the city again. Factory gates opened and workers emerged. Wages might be paid at the end of the week, making certain nights especially busy. Shops filled. Pubs became loud. Music halls offered songs, comedy, spectacle, and escape. Entertainment mattered deeply in a life of hard labor. A music hall performance gave people stories, melodies, and jokes to carry back into the week. Boxing drew crowds because it combined skill, toughness, and the possibility of rising from poverty through physical ability. Boxing also connected legitimate sport to the underworld. Promoters, bookmakers, publicans, fighters, and gang protectors occupied overlapping spaces. A talented boxer might know men involved in betting. A gang could recruit fighters as enforcers. A public house could host both sporting conversation and criminal negotiation. The boundary was porous. Not every boxer was criminal, and not every bookmaker belonged to a gang. But the same social networks brought them together. Horse racing held similar appeal on a larger scale. For someone who spent the week inside a workshop, a race day offered open air, color, motion, and crowds. Excursion trains allowed ordinary workers to travel farther than earlier generations could easily imagine. Passengers packed platforms early in the morning. Food and drink were carried for the journey. Tips were exchanged before the train moved. By arrival, excitement had already begun. The racecourse was a temporary city. Bookmakers called odds from their pitches. Clerks wrote rapidly. Spectators studied horses they may have known only from printed lists. Sellers offered refreshments. Pickpockets searched for opportunity. Police watched known offenders. Gang members watched the police. The race itself lasted only minutes. Money changed meaning at the finish. A worthless slip became a winning claim. A week's spare coins disappeared. A bookmaker who had accepted too many bets on one horse faced a dangerous payout. A gang collector appeared at the edge of the ring to discuss an obligation. The emotional speed of racing made the betting world addictive. Hope rose and fell in seconds. Organized crime lived in the space around that emotion. A customer focused on the horse might not notice the men quietly determining which bookmaker could stand where. A respectable spectator could leave unaware that violence had been threatened nearby. The best protection racket is partly invisible. If everyone pays, no attack is necessary. The Birmingham boys understood this. Their public reputation did work before their men arrived. A bookmaker who had heard what happened to another could decide cooperation was cheaper than resistance. Yet reputation had to be renewed. That is why gang violence became ritualized. A refusal led to a confrontation. A confrontation led to an example. The example traveled through rumor. The original Peaky Blinders had used similar logic on a neighborhood scale. A boy beaten on one street warned others. A constable attack during an arrest demonstrated that the gang would defend its own. A bright scarf and angled cap announced membership before a word was spoken. Kimber's organization took the same social technology and applied it to business. Fear became transferable. It no longer belonged only to a street. It belonged to a name. As evening fell after the races, men returned to stations. Winners celebrated. Losers reconsidered every decision. Bookmakers counted cash. Gang leaders counted obligations. The train back to Birmingham carried stories. Someone had won on a long shot. Someone had lost a month's wages. Someone had refused to pay protection. Someone would be waiting for him next time. Back in the city, the pubs remained open until closing time. Families waited for wages that might arrive reduced by drink or gambling. Arguments began. Songs spilled into the street. Police prepared for the hours when public order became most fragile. A gang member returning from a successful day at the races could enter his neighborhood with money and prestige. He bought drinks. He wore better clothes. Younger boys noticed. They did not see the future trial. They saw the coins. This is how criminal culture reproduces itself. The reward is public. The cost comes later and often in private. A sentence is served behind walls. An injury is endured in a back room. A frightened family moves away. A victim's pain receives less attention than a gangster's style. Sleep eventually settled over Birmingham unevenly. In quiet suburban streets, lamps went dark behind larger windows. In industrial districts, late shifts continued. Furnaces glowed. Canal water reflected small pieces of light. A constable's boots crossed wet pavement. Somewhere, a bookmaker recorded the day's totals. Somewhere else, a mother listened for a son who had not come home. The city rested, but never completely. It was always making something. Metal objects, fortunes, smoke, and reputations that would outlive the people who created them. The police force that patrolled this city changed as steadily as the criminal world it pursued. When Birmingham's officers first appeared in the 19th century, the very idea of professional policing was still new enough to create suspicion. Earlier generations had relied on watchmen, parish constables, magistrates, soldiers during riots, and various local arrangements that were often inconsistent. A permanent uniformed force promised order, but it also placed representatives of government into daily neighborhood life. The early constable needed physical endurance more than technical equipment. He walked his beat repeatedly until every doorway became familiar. He checked whether shops were secure. He moved drunken men from the road. He separated fights, delivered messages, reported fires, watched lodging houses, and responded to cries for help. His notebook was a vital tool. He recorded names, times, descriptions, and events in handwriting that might later be examined in court. A mistake could weaken a prosecution. A forgotten detail could allow an offender to deny involvement. The whistle offered one of the few immediate ways to summon assistance. Its sound cut through streets and courtyards, but help still had to be close enough to hear. In a sudden gang attack, seconds mattered. The police station served as the center of this world. Prisoners were brought through heavy doors. Charges were written. Property was recorded. Cells held people arrested for offenses ranging from drunkenness to serious violence. Families waited outside for news. Detectives compared information. Uniforms dried after rain. Birmingham's Steelhouse Lane lockup, opened in the late 19th century, became one of the most significant sites in the city's policing history. Its cells received generations of prisoners, including men from the era associated with the real Peaky Blinders. Inside a Victorian cell, glamour disappeared. The walls were hard. The door controlled light and movement. A name famous in the street meant little once the bolt closed. Police photography added another layer of control. A prisoner's face was recorded against a plain background. Officers noted physical features, scars, tattoos, height, age, occupation, and known associates. The goal was to turn a mobile identity into information the institution could preserve. The criminal tried to remain fluid. The record tried to make him permanent. Fingerprints would later strengthen this process. Their growing use in the early 20th century reduced dependence on names and appearance. A man could lie about who he was, but the patterns on his fingertips could connect him to an earlier arrest. For repeat offenders, anonymity became harder. Communication improved as well. Police stations gained telephone links. Call boxes and street telephones allowed officers and citizens to report events more quickly. Mounted units and later motor vehicles extended the distance police could cover. Rafter encouraged these developments because Birmingham's expansion demanded them. In 1911, the city absorbed large surrounding districts and greatly increased its area and population. A force designed for the older boundaries could not patrol the enlarged Birmingham without more stations, officers, and transport. New neighborhoods required local knowledge to be rebuilt. An officer transferred to an outer district had to learn roads, pubs, factories, and families just as earlier constables had learned the central courts. The force also began to include women in limited roles. At first, police matrons dealt with female prisoners and children. During and after the First World War, women took on wider duties in public spaces, though their authority and status remained restricted. Compared with male officers, their presence reflected broader social change. Women were increasingly visible in public employment, political activism, welfare work, and reform campaigns. They brought attention to offenses and victims that male policing had often misunderstood or neglected. The modern police force was therefore not created in one moment. It emerged through layers of reform, each responding to new problems. Gang violence encouraged recruitment and training. Urban expansion encouraged stations and transport. Mobile crime encouraged communication and intelligence sharing. Public criticism encouraged professional standards. The racecourse wars demonstrated the need for cooperation between forces. An officer in Birmingham might recognize a gang member, but an officer near Epsom needed that information before the man arrived. Lists and photographs had to travel. Detectives needed to know aliases and associations. Local records became part of national knowledge. The criminal underworld adapted by becoming less obvious. Men used intermediaries. Leaders avoided carrying weapons or stolen property. Businesses provided legitimate explanations for income. Instructions were passed verbally. Violence was delegated to men who knew only part of the wider operation. This division protected those at the top. A street fighter caught after an assault could be sentenced without ever proving who had paid him. A bookmaker could deny knowing that his protectors had threatened rivals. A gang leader could remain far from the scene. The law faced the problem of organization without formal documents. Conspiracy charges offered one method. Rather than treating each blow as an isolated act, prosecutors could argue that a group had planned violence together. The Epsom Road case became powerful because it revealed preparation, vehicles, numbers, weapons, movement, and shared purpose. Courts also depended on witnesses. Gang intimidation made witnesses vulnerable, and allegations of bribery appeared in racecourse cases. A person who had seen an attack might receive money to change his story or a threat to remain silent. Police had to protect evidence from both fear and corruption. Corruption was a constant concern because betting generated cash and officers possessed valuable information. A bookmaker wanted to know when a raid was planned. A gang wanted to know whether detectives were watching a station. A small payment could save a large illegal business. Not every accusation was true, and most officers were not corrupt. But the possibility damaged trust. Rafter's emphasis on discipline and training was partly an attempt to strengthen the institution against such pressure. Professional identity became important. The constable was expected to see himself not as a hired watchman, but as a member of a service with standards, education, and public duty. Training in law reduced arbitrary decisions. Physical instruction prepared officers for disorder. Written reports allowed supervisors to review conduct. Still, policing remained shaped by the values of the age. Authorities often viewed working-class leisure with suspicion. Street betting, public drinking, rough games, and gatherings of young people were treated as threats to order. Laws were not enforced equally across class lines. Gambling inside elite spaces could appear respectable, while a small wager in a poor street produced arrest. This double standard fueled resentment. A wealthy racegoer might place a large legal bet, while a factory worker's penny stake was driven underground. The law did not eliminate gambling. It separated acceptable gambling from unacceptable gambling according to place, method, and social status. Gangs prospered inside that separation. The same contradiction appeared in alcohol. Respectable clubs offered private drinking. Poor districts depended on public houses visible to police. Disorder in the street was punished, but the exhausting labor and housing conditions that made escape attractive were slower to change. Reformers argued over causes. Some blamed individual moral failure. Some blamed drink. Some blamed weak parenting, popular entertainment, or lack of religion. Others pointed to low wages, overcrowding, poor education, dangerous work, and unequal opportunity. Each explanation contained part of the truth, but none alone could describe why one boy joined a gang while his brother did not. Personal temperament mattered. Family support mattered. Chance mattered. A friendship formed at the wrong time could redirect a life. An employer willing to overlook a minor offense could save one young man from repeated crime. A harsh sentence could remove another for years. The city was not a machine that produced identical outcomes. It produced pressure. People responded differently. Religious organizations, working men's clubs, schools, sports teams, trade unions, and charitable groups offered alternatives to gang belonging. A boy could find identity through a chapel, a football club, a workshop, or political activism instead of a street group. Football became especially important as professional clubs and mass spectatorship grew. Birmingham and the surrounding industrial districts developed fierce sporting loyalties that could channel neighborhood identity into organized competition. Crowd disorder did not disappear, but belonging no longer required membership in a gang. Trade unions offered another form of collective power. Workers who once depended on personal toughness could organize around wages and conditions. Employers and authorities sometimes treated unions as dangerous, especially during strikes. But collective bargaining created a lawful language for grievances that street violence could never solve. Political participation expanded slowly as voting rights widened. Working-class men gained greater access to formal power. Women eventually won voting rights in stages after long struggle. The city's poor remained unequal, but they were not entirely voiceless. These developments weakened the social appeal of the old gang. A Peaky Blinders reputation offered immediate authority, but no lasting institution. A union, club, party, or cooperative could survive beyond one man's physical strength. The gang was powerful in the moment. Modern society was powerful over time. By the interwar years, Birmingham's police could respond to organized violence with resources unimaginable to the first constables of 1839. Yet crime had also become more hidden, financial, and connected. The visible battle in the street was only one form. Stolen goods moved through fences who appeared respectable. Illegal bookmakers employed clerks rather than fighters. Club owners paid for quiet protection. Fraud required calculation more than fists. The underworld learned to wear a suit without announcing itself. The famous Peaky Blinder costume therefore belongs to a transitional age. It came from a time when criminal identity was displayed openly because fear depended on recognition. Later gangsters often found greater protection in appearing ordinary. Billy Kimber stood between those worlds. He had the background of an industrial worker and street organizer, but the reach of a modern entrepreneur. He understood that violence was most profitable when attached to a system. The system outlived his street power. Illegal betting continued through the Second World War and into the post-war decades. Runners still carried bets. Factories still contained informal networks. Police still raided operations that returned after each interruption. But eventually, the law itself changed. And when it did, the criminal economy changed with it. For decades, governments tried to suppress off-course betting without ending the public desire for it. The result was a vast underground system that became so ordinary that many communities barely thought of it as crime. A man placing a small bet through a factory runner did not imagine himself entering the underworld. He was participating in a familiar custom shared by neighbors and co-workers. Yet every coin passed through an illegal structure. That structure required secrecy, collection, records, and enforcement. It created repeated contact between ordinary bettors and professional criminals. It also consumed police time while producing fines that often failed to discourage established bookmakers. By the middle of the 20th century, the contradiction had become difficult to defend. The law was not preventing betting. It was shaping the way betting operated. The Betting and Gaming Act of 1960 changed that system. In May 1961, licensed betting shops began opening across Britain. Within a short period, thousands appeared on high streets and neighborhood roads. For the first time, an ordinary bettor could walk into a legal shop and place an off-course cash bet without relying on a hidden runner or a backroom. The change did not eliminate criminal gambling, but it removed one of the foundations on which street bookmaking organizations had been built. A legal bookmaker could advertise a fixed location, keep formal records, employ staff openly, and seek police protection against robbery. A customer who had a more regulated relationship with the business. Protection gangs no longer possessed the same ability to claim that only they could enforce order. Legalization transferred authority. The criminal strongman lost part of his role to the licensed shop, the regulator, and the court. This was the long-term answer that Victorian raids had never provided. When a popular activity is driven underground, enforcement may reduce it, but it can also create a market for criminal protection. Bringing the activity into a legal framework removes some opportunities while creating new responsibilities and new risks. Betting shops themselves became controversial. Critics worried that easy access would increase gambling and deepen household hardship. Supporters argued that open regulation was more honest than pretending the underground market did not exist. Both concerns contained truth. Legal betting did not remove addiction, loss, or exploitation. It changed who controlled the business and how the state responded to it. For the history of Birmingham's gangs, the shift is essential. The world that made Billy Kimber powerful had depended on a particular combination: illegal off-course demand, cash-rich racecourses, weak coordination between police forces, and bookmakers needing private protection. By the 1960s, that combination had largely disappeared. Racecourses were better managed. Police intelligence was national. Legal shops handled ordinary bets. Criminal organizations moved toward other opportunities. The transformation of the underworld continued. After the Second World War, Birmingham became a city of factories on an even greater scale. Motor manufacturing, engineering, and mass production drew workers from across Britain and from overseas. Irish migration continued. New communities arrived from the Caribbean and South Asia, adding languages, religions, food, music, and experience to the city. The population expanded and changed. Old inner-city housing was cleared. Tower blocks and large estates promised modern life with indoor bathrooms, more space, and better sanitation. Roads were rebuilt around the motor car. Concrete replaced many Victorian streets. For some families, rehousing brought enormous improvement. For others, redevelopment broke neighborhood networks that had provided childcare, friendship, credit, and identity. A new flat could be cleaner, but farther from work and relatives. A cleared street could remove both danger and belonging. Crime adapted to the new geography. The corner gang did not vanish from British life, but its methods, culture, and opportunities changed. Cars allowed rapid movement. Stolen goods could be transported farther. Robbery, fraud, black markets, clubs, drugs, and later electronic crime offered profits unrelated to horse racing pitches. The industrial economy that had once supplied stable mass employment began to weaken in the later 20th century. Factory closures and deindustrialization created new deprivation in parts of Birmingham and the wider West Midlands. The city that had made 1,000 trades lost many of the jobs that had defined generations. Once again, social change produced criminal opportunity, but the resulting groups were not the Peaky Blinders reborn. They belonged to different communities, technologies, markets, and times. Using the old name for every later gang hides these differences. The real Peaky Blinders belonged to the late Victorian and Edwardian city. Their streets were lit by gas and early electricity. Their movement depended on walking, trams, horses, and trains. Their communication depended on speech, paper, telegraph, and personal contact. Their style came from working-class menswear of the period. Their economy grew beside factories, pubs, pawnshops, and street bookmakers. Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys belonged to the transition into modern organized crime. They used railways and motor vehicles to extend power across regions. They built alliances beyond neighborhood identity. They treated violence as a tool for controlling a market. Later gangs entered a world of telephones, cars, mass media, drugs, and international finance. The word gang remained, but almost everything around it changed. Memory often compresses these stages into one image. A man in a flat cap stands beneath factory smoke. He is imagined as a veteran, bookmaker, political fixer, racecourse boss, and local protector all at once. Historically, those roles belonged to different people in different decades. The early Peaky Blinders rose before the First World War, especially in the 1890s. The Birmingham Boys and Billy Kimber became more powerful in the 1910s and early 1920s. The great racecourse conflicts involved national alliances, not a single family controlling small heath. Tommy Shelby unites these histories because fiction requires a central character. History rarely provides one. Real change emerges from thousands of lives interacting with institutions, markets, technologies, and accidents. No one man created Victorian Birmingham's poverty. No one man invented street gang culture. No one man created illegal betting demand. No one police chief ended crime. Even Billy Kimber's power depended on bookmakers, runners, enforcers, railway workers, spectators, allies, rivals, and customers. The search for a real Tommy Shelby, therefore, leads to the wrong question. There was no exact historical equivalent because the character was designed to carry the weight of an entire era. Parts of him resemble several real types. The ambitious bookmaker, the decorated veteran returning from war, the street gang leader who understands politics, the industrial businessman seeking respectability, the racecourse organizer willing to use violence. But no surviving record reveals a single Birmingham man who followed the complete path shown in the drama. Billy Kimber comes closest only in relation to racecourse power, and even then the differences are greater than the similarities. He was born before the fictional Shelby, rose through a separate network, and survived the conflict that television rewrote as his death. The original Peaky Blinders were smaller figures. Their names survive because police photographed them and newspapers described their offenses. They did not leave memoirs explaining their beliefs. They did not build companies whose archives historians can easily examine. Their silence gave fiction room. In the absence of their voices, Birmingham itself becomes the main character. The city explains more than any invented biography. Its rapid growth explains overcrowding. Its workshops explain the discipline and dangers of labor. Its inequality explains the attraction of visible status. Its pubs and streets explain where groups formed. Its transport links explain how local criminals became national. Its police reforms explain why the old gangs weakened. Its love of racing explains why betting created fortunes. Its redevelopment explains why memory later floated free from place. The history is not a tale of one family's rise. It is a tale of systems changing. The first system was the industrial street. The second was the illegal betting network. The third was the regulated modern city. Each created its own form of power. In the industrial street, power belonged to the group willing to fight. In the betting network, power belonged to the organization able to coordinate money and violence across distance. In the regulated city, power shifted toward institutions capable of licensing, recording, communicating, and enforcing rules at scale. Criminals never disappeared, but the kind of criminal who succeeded changed. That is the deeper history behind the Peaky Blinders name. It is not simply the story of a gang. It is the story of British crime becoming modern. The surviving history becomes clearest when we return to the individuals who briefly step out of the records. George Eastwood appears because he ordered ginger beer and was attacked. We do not know every thought he carried into the public house that night in 1890. Perhaps he expected nothing more than a quiet drink. Perhaps he knew some of the men who watched him. Perhaps the choice of a non-alcoholic drink was only an excuse for a group already looking for a victim. What we know is that he left and was followed. He was beaten badly enough to require weeks of hospital care. The attack helped place the small Heath Peaky Blinders into the newspaper record. For the gang, publicity created a name. For Eastwood, publicity followed suffering. This imbalance remains common in crime history. The offender becomes famous because of what he did. The victim becomes a sentence explaining why the offender matters. To tell the story responsibly, we must reverse that habit for a moment. The Peaky Blinders' reputation was built from other people's pain. Every dramatic newspaper report represented an injured body, a frightened family, a lost wage, or a life altered by an encounter that may have lasted only minutes. Constable George Snipe appears because he did not survive. At 29, he was still a young man. His duty on July 19, 1897 was not to defeat a criminal empire. It was to deal with disorder and help make an arrest. The crowd's decision to intervene changed the meaning of the moment. One brick ended his life and transformed a drunken disturbance into a killing remembered more than a century later. The object itself was ordinary. The choice to throw it was not. Snipe's death shows the danger of collective violence. Within a crowd, responsibility can become blurred. One man shouts, another pushes, another throws, others encourage or simply remain close. Afterward, each participant can claim that the fatal act belonged to someone else. The law searched for individual guilt inside group action. George Cloggy Williams was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to life imprisonment. His conviction gave the case a legal ending, but it could not fully explain the crowd. Why did so many people believe freeing a prisoner justified attacking the police? Some may have been gang associates. Some may have been drunk. Some may have hated the constable personally. Others may have joined because movement itself creates pressure. A crowd can turn hesitation into action by making each individual feel less visible. The old gang culture depended on this force. A lone youth might avoid a fight. 10 companions made him brave. The police tried to break that confidence by demonstrating that the state could act collectively too. More officers, stronger coordination, organized training, and severe sentences told gang members that the crowd would no longer guarantee safety. Charles Houghton Rafter appears as the administrator who understood this problem. He did not become famous through a single street confrontation. His power came from organization. He expanded the force, improved training, and treated crime prevention as a professional task. His long service stretched from the age of slogging gangs into the era of motor patrols and police telephones. Rafter's career represents the institutional side of modernization. A gang leader gains authority through personality and fear. When he dies or is imprisoned, the organization may collapse. A professional institution stores knowledge, trains replacements, and continues beyond one leader. This is why the police eventually possessed an advantage no street gang could match. They could learn across generations. An officer retired, but his reports remained. A detective transferred, but a photograph remained in the file. A station closed, but the force continued elsewhere. The gang preserved memory through stories. The police preserved memory through records. Both forms shaped what later generations believed. The photographed offenders stand between them. Men such as Harry Fowles, Ernest Bales, and Stephen McNichol survive visually because they passed through police custody. Their faces now circulate far beyond Birmingham. often presented as the real Peaky Blinders. Yet a photograph cannot prove membership in the precise way modern audiences expect. The label might describe a known association, a style, a district, or a type of offender. The men may never have stood together in one room. Popular culture arranges them into a caste because the human mind prefers groups with clear boundaries. The archive offers fragments. The viewer creates a gang. Look closely at the clothes in such images. They communicate effort. Even under arrest, the men appear conscious of appearance. The coat, scarf, and cap belong to a working-class fashion that could be both practical and proud. A heavy coat protected against weather. Strong boots suited industrial streets. A cap was affordable and common. Style emerged through how these ordinary items were worn. The angle of the cap mattered. The scarf's color mattered. The cut of the trousers mattered. A man who lacked property could still control his silhouette. This attention to dress was not unique to criminals. Working people across Britain used clothing to claim dignity. Sunday bests separated worship and leisure from labor. A new suit marked weddings, funerals, holidays, and advancement. The gang transformed the same desire into intimidation. I may come from a poor street, but I refuse to look powerless. Billy Kimber carried that ambition farther. His life began in industrial Birmingham and ended far from the image of the young street rough. He became powerful through gambling, then survived long enough to move toward respectability. That survival is historically important. Fiction often gives gangsters endings that match their violence. They die in gunfights, betrayed by allies, or defeated by a more brilliant rival. Such endings feel satisfying because they turn consequence into spectacle. Real consequence may be slower. Kimber watched his southern power weaken. Associates were imprisoned. Rivals took territory. The criminal system changed around him. He aged. There is no single frame in which his empire falls. It thins across years. This is how many real forms of power disappear. A meeting is no longer attended. A payment goes to someone else. A bookmaker stops returning a message. A younger man becomes more feared. The old leader moves away and discovers that distance can be presented as retirement rather than defeat. By the time Kimber died in 1945, Britain had endured another world war. Birmingham had been bombed. Industry had again become part of national survival. The streets of his youth belonged to another age. The Peaky Blinders name had already begun its transformation from living threat into memory. Older residents recalled men who had swaggered through districts before the First World War. Children listened. Some details remained precise. Others merged with later gang stories. A grandfather's enemy became a legendary fighter. A pile of betting coins became a fortune. A weighted cap became a razor cap. A local tough became a ruler of Birmingham. The process was not deliberate deception. Memory naturally seeks meaning. A story told at a kitchen table must hold attention. It sharpens the character, simplifies the setting, and moves quickly toward the moment of danger. Over generations, 100 separate men can become one perfect gangster. That figure was waiting when modern drama needed him. The fictional Tommy Shelby is powerful because he combines contradictions drawn from real history. He is working class but moves among aristocrats. He is a criminal but seeks legitimacy. He is violent but wounded. He belongs to family yet stands alone. He uses old street loyalty while understanding modern business. He represents Birmingham but reaches toward national politics. No real man needed to possess all these qualities because fiction assembled them from the age itself. The war trauma came from veterans. The betting empire came partly from men like Kimber. The gang name came from the Victorian streets. The tailored style came from working-class fashion. The political ambition came from Birmingham's powerful civic tradition. The result feels historically true even when the biography is invented. This is why viewers sometimes ask where Tommy Shelby is buried or which photograph shows him. The character occupies historical space so convincingly that imagination demands a body. But searching for that body misunderstands the achievement of the story. Tommy Shelby was never one man. He was Birmingham's contradictions given a face. The real history is distributed among thousands of people whose names are less memorable. The woman who took in laundry to keep rent paid. The child who carried betting slips through a factory gate. The constable who walked alone into a hostile street. The bookmaker who paid protection because refusal endangered his family. The young fighter who believed a gang offered the only respect available. The reformer who entered a back court and demanded clean water. The railway clerk whose timetable made national crime possible. The witness who stayed silent. The victim whose name appeared once and vanished. Together, they created the world behind the legend. Some pieces of that world can still be approached through the places that survived. A preserved court of Birmingham back-to-back houses allows visitors to step into rooms built for the city's expanding industrial population. The walls stand close. The courtyard is small. The distance between home, neighbor, work, water, and waste becomes visible in a way that statistics cannot provide. Walk through such a space slowly, and the social pressure of the 19th-century city becomes easier to understand. A family could hear the argument next door. A child could cross the court in seconds. A rumor could move through several households before a constable reached the entrance. Privacy was limited, but no one was entirely alone. The same courtyard that spread illness could spread help. The same closeness that created conflict could save a family after sickness or death. History becomes most accurate when both truths are held together. Victorian working-class Birmingham was not only darkness. People created joy under difficult conditions. They decorated rooms, celebrated weddings, sang songs, cared for neighbors, followed sports, and took pride in skill. They formed communities strong enough to survive loss that would overwhelm a solitary household. Nor was industrial growth only exploitation. It created inventions, trades, civic confidence, and opportunities unknown to earlier generations. Skilled workers built objects used across the world. Birmingham became a place where a person with knowledge and energy might establish a workshop or business. But opportunity was distributed unevenly. The city generated wealth faster than it generated healthy housing and security. The gap between promise and experience created anger. The gang occupied that gap. It offered belonging without patience, status without education, income without permission, protection without law. Each offer carried a hidden debt. Belonging required loyalty during violence. Status depended on fear. Income could vanish after arrest. Protection could become extortion. The Peaky Blinder image shows only the first half of each bargain. History reveals the second. The old police lockup offers another doorway into the period. Its cells represent the moment when street identity met institutional power. Outside, a man might be known by a nickname spoken with caution. Inside, he became a prisoner number, a charge, a photograph, and a line in a register. The process was designed to strip away the performance of power. A cell did not care how a cap was angled. The iron door answered every reputation in the same way. Yet even imprisonment could become part of gang identity. A man who served time might return with greater status among companions. He had endured the state and survived. Punishment therefore worked differently depending on the community interpreting it. For respectable society, prison marked disgrace. For some gang cultures, it marked proof. This conflict complicated reform. The state could remove a man, but it could not easily control the story told when he returned. Education, employment, and stable housing often weakened gang loyalty more effectively because they offered a rival story. A young man could become known as a skilled worker, a union representative, a boxer, a soldier, a father, or a shopkeeper rather than as a street fighter. Identity did not have to be destroyed. It had to be redirected. Birmingham's canals preserve another layer of the story. Their water once carried the heavy materials of industrial expansion. Coal darkened boats and hands. Iron moved toward workshops. Finished goods moved outward. Bridges connected neighborhoods while also creating hidden spaces beneath them. At night, canal routes could feel separate from the bright commercial streets. Water absorbed the glow of lamps. Warehouses became dark walls. Footsteps carried differently beside the towpath. The canals remind us that the underworld was never truly under the city. It existed within the same infrastructure that served legitimate trade. A train carried families and gang fighters. A pub served meals and accepted bets. A workshop made tools and supplied improvised weapons. A bookmaker could be both a businessman and a criminal depending on the location of the transaction. The same modern systems that created prosperity created opportunities for organized crime. This connection is central to the story. Crime was not the opposite of modernity. It modernized alongside the city. The street gang used the density of industrial neighborhoods. The Birmingham boys used railways, race calendars, and mass leisure. Later criminals used cars, telephones, clubs, and financial systems. Technology does not choose a moral side. It increases the reach of whoever learns to use it. Billy Kimber understood reach. His real achievement was not personal bravery in a fight. It was coordination. He recognized that men from Birmingham could travel, form alliances, and control protection beyond the city. This is why his history matters more than the dramatic version of his death. He marks the point where the local rough became the organized crime boss. The original Peaky Blinders had already shown the power of a name. Kimber showed the power of a network. The police response showed the power of an institution. The racecourse wars became a contest among these three forms of authority. Reputation moved first. The network expanded it. The institution eventually contained it. No victory was complete. Gang names survived in memory. Illegal betting survived decades of raids. Organized crime moved into new markets. But the particular world of the Peaky Blinders ended because the conditions supporting it changed. This may be the most important difference between history and legend. Legend imagines that powerful men change the world through will. History shows that the world also changes powerful men. A Peaky Blinder could dominate a late Victorian street, but would be less effective against coordinated motor patrols, fingerprint records, and national police communication. Billy Kimber could control vulnerable bookmakers when protection was private, but his model weakened when betting became licensed and racecourses became better regulated. The city did not defeat crime through one gunfight. It altered the environment in which crime operated. Housing reform opened cramped spaces. Education supervised children and expanded opportunity. Professional policing increased the cost of public violence. Transport and communication first aided gangs, then aided the state. Legal betting reduced the underground market that had enriched protectors. Each change removed one piece of the old structure. Eventually, the famous cap remained after the system beneath it had disappeared. That cap now carries meanings its original wearers could never have imagined. It represents Birmingham, defiance, style, masculinity, trauma, ambition, and danger. It appears in art, tourism, clothing, and popular entertainment. The symbol has traveled farther than any real gang member. There is a final irony in that journey. The young men who wore similar caps wanted to be seen. They succeeded beyond measure. But they are no longer seen as they really were. The image became cleaner than the streets. The suits became sharper. The plans became more intelligent. The violence became cinematic. The victims moved out of frame. The true history asks us to bring them back. It asks us to remember George Eastwood leaving a public house and realizing he was being followed. It asks us to remember Constable George Snipe entering a crowd from which he would not return alive. It asks us to remember families in back courts who endured gang intimidation alongside poverty and disease. It asks us to remember bookmakers who paid not because they admired gangsters, but because they were afraid. It also asks us to remember that many young men entered this world before they fully understood its cost. A teenager saw clothing, money, and companionship. He did not see himself as a historical warning. He saw the next evening, the next fight, the next bet, the next chance to prove that he mattered. The tragedy of the real Peaky Blinders is not that they failed to build a glamorous empire. It is that fear became one of the few forms of importance available to them, and they chose to use it against people living in the same hard city. The achievement of Birmingham is not that it erased its rough past. It is that the city continually remade itself from the same forces that once threatened to divide it. Industry created smoke and skill. Migration created tension and community. Poverty created desperation and solidarity. Policing created protection and resentment. Betting created pleasure and exploitation. Nothing in the story is simple because the city itself was never simple. Perhaps this is why the legend feels so compelling. Birmingham does not fit the polished image of Imperial Britain. Its history is made from workshops rather than palaces, back courts rather than country estates, and men and women whose labor filled the world with objects while leaving few monuments to themselves. The Peaky Blinders myth gives that forgotten industrial population a dramatic place in history. It says that people from streets ignored by the powerful could become impossible to ignore. That emotional truth deserves recognition. But it must not be purchased by turning predators into heroes. The real history is stronger because it does not need a hero. It has a city growing from 75,000 people to more than 500,000 in a century. A city building canals, factories, schools, police stations, houses, courts, and fortunes. A city sending manufactured goods across the world while struggling to provide clean air and space to its workers. A city where boys formed gangs in narrow streets and later traveled by railway to fight over racecourse money. A city where a brass caster named Billy Kimber rose beyond every original Peaky Blinder and helped transform local violence into national organized crime. A city where police learned that courage on one beat was not enough and built systems capable of remembering, coordinating, and responding. A city that eventually legalized the betting market whose illegality had enriched gang protectors. The complete story is larger than Tommy Shelby because no single person can contain it. The fictional leader stands at the center of his family. The real history has no center. It spreads through streets, workshops, courtrooms, stations, pubs, racecourses, and memories. It begins before the First World War, not after it. It rises among boys and young men whose names were sometimes used loosely under one feared label. It changes when Rafter's police reforms make public gang violence harder. It expands when Kimber organizes the Birmingham boys around betting and protection. It reaches national scale when railway lines carry fighters toward racecourses. It breaks open during the wars with Sabini's network and the Epsom Road battle. It fades as arrests, regulation, and social change remove the conditions that once made it profitable. Then it waits in family memory. Decades pass. The factories change. The courts are demolished. The gang members die. The photographs remain. A writer hears stories from parents and grandparents. He imagines silver coins on a table, caps pulled low, men with guns, and children watching from the edge of the room. From those fragments, a new family is born. The Shelbys step into history's empty spaces. They do not replace the real Peaky Blinders. They reveal how badly people wanted the fragments to form a complete story. But now, beneath the fiction, the older city can be seen again. Listen beyond the gunshots and dramatic speeches. Hear the factory whistle. Hear the canal horse moving beneath a bridge. Hear coins counted in the back room of a pub. Hear a constable's boots approaching through fog. Hear a train leaving Birmingham with bookmakers, spectators, and gang fighters aboard. Hear the race crowd rising as horses approach the finish. Hear the sudden silence after violence. These were the sounds of the real world behind the name. There was no Tommy Shelby at its center. There did not need to be. The true Peaky Blinders story was never about one man who conquered Birmingham. It was about Birmingham creating men who believed the only way to escape invisibility was to become feared. Then the city changed, the criminal world moved on, and the feared men became shadows. History remembers the caps. It remembers the swagger. It remembers the name. But the deeper truth remains in the streets that made them, the people who suffered beneath them, and the system that eventually replaced them. Tommy Shelby never led the Peaky Blinders. The city did.